Hello and welcome back to the Mediabox at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, online and in Strasbourg. Politicians need a particularly high level of protection of freedom of speech, but freedom is not unlimited and should respect the rule of law. That's a key conclusion of an adopted report put to the Assembly. The author of that report is with me now, Boriss Cilevičs. Your report, should politicians be prosecuted for statements made in the exercise of their mandate? What's your thought on that question?
Basically, no, but it is possible under certain circumstances which are very clearly and strictly defined. Certainly, it cannot be done arbitrarily.
Now, the adopted resolution did go into details regarding two member states, Turkey being one of them, Spain being the other. In Turkey's case, the Assembly said it should take urgent steps to restore the independence of the judiciary. What's the issue here?
The problem of Turkish judiciary and disproportionate sentences and verdicts is not new. Only last April the Assembly adopted a special resolution on this issue. The problem is that Turkish judiciary interprets the concept of terrorism and support for terrorism in a very broad manner. So sometimes parliamentarians are sentenced to just calling for more autonomy for the regions which are inhabited by the Kurdish minorities. And it was not that long ago then the very referral to these regions as Kurdish regions were also could entail criminal prosecution and quite harsh sentences. So basically even parliamentary questions asked about some policies of some actions of security forces in these regions and so on were also interpreted by prosecution and by courts as a sort of a support for terrorism. And Turkish parliamentarians are sentenced for statements made many years ago in completely different circumstances, including in private. And so this is a systemic problem of Turkish judiciary.
And in Spain, the adopted text said that, and I quote, "Mere expression of pro-independence views is not a ground for criminal prosecution." So essentially, is the Assembly saying that Spain should not have jailed Catalan politicians convicted for their part for organising what was seen as an unconstitutional referendum?
Again, it depends. First, Spain is fundamentally different. Spain is indeed a vivid democracy with long democratic traditions, and indeed it's not the case that people can be sentenced and convicted only for speaking in favor of advocating independence of Catalonia. This is not the case. The problem is that the concept of the rule of law includes also a very important principle of proportionality on punishment. Those Catalan politicians who organized this unconstitutional referendum and who ignored injunctions of the Constitutional Court and called for mass protests, they clearly acted illegally. But the sanctions for this kind of breaches of the law cannot be the same as for very serious crimes. So 9 to 13 years in prison, it's like murderers or rapists. So these judgments are clearly disproportional, and this is a problem with Spain.
So where does this leave the Spanish authorities now? What is the government being recommended to do according to the recommended text of this report?
I was really happy to see that already yesterday, so the next day after adoption of this resolution, the government took a decision to pardon those 9 Catalan politicians who have been convicted and who spent already some 3 years in prison. And this is one of the measures we strongly recommended. And indeed, this is a very good step in the right direction. Of course, this does not resolve the problem as such, because still there are ongoing prosecutions for maybe lower ranked politicians. And it would be quite illogical if the leaders of political movements are pardoned, but their followers are still tried and convicted for following the same line. There is still a problem with those politicians who were prosecuted and found refuge abroad. So Spanish government still insists on the extradition, although so far all extradition requests were rejected by the Belgium, UK courts. So democratic states also have serious doubts and see no strong grounds for criminal prosecution, and this is why I reject this extradition request. So a lot has to be done, but these pardons are indeed the first important step that we call for dialogue and conciliation and compromise. And this is a proper way how to tackle even very serious and very sensitive and delicate political disagreements rather than heavy-handed court verdicts and putting your political opponents to prison. So how things are going on in Spain, it looks really inspiring and promising, and I very much hope that Spain, as a really vivid ancient democracy, will be able to resolve even so serious political problem as separatism of Catalonia.
So is the adopted text saying to all member states that this is a question of proportionality?
Not only. Proportionality comes into play when indeed politicians violated the law. And with Catalan independence referendum, it was indeed the case. So these politicians who organized it can be punished and probably should be punished. I don't know, maybe deprived of their mandates or fined or somehow else, but certainly not to 12 years in prison, what all legal experts say. In the case of Turkey, it's somewhat different. So people were punished for something that is not a crime whatsoever. Asking parliamentary questions, for example, and making statements in favor of its own regions, and demanding transparency and accountability of security forces. This is the right of elected politicians, and not only. It's actually this freedom of expression and freedom of assembly is the right which belongs to every human being. But politicians maybe must be protected even more because they express not only their own views, but the views of their voters, those people who elected them to represent their interests. And in many cases in Turkey, and I would say in most of cases in Turkey, unfortunately, the proportionality is not relevant simply because there is no crime in what many people sentenced to long prison terms actually did.
Boriss Cilevičs, thank you very much indeed for joining us today in the Mediabox.
Thank you, Charles.